Ladies and gentlemen, let's move to our second annual lecture. Friedrich von Wieser belongs to the towering figures of the second generation of the Austrian School who produced such scholars as Nobel Prize laureate F.A. von Hayek. Wieser taught here in Prague for more than a decade, leaving only in 1903 to take over Karl Menger's chair in Vienna. He will always be remembered by economists, and hopefully not only by economists, as the author of the concept of opportunity costs. I'm delighted to introduce to you PCPE 2011 Wieser Memorial Prize recipient Professor Terry Anderson. There has not been many economists who can claim to originate the whole branch of economics. Professor Anderson belongs to such a tiny and very privileged group. Thanks to his long-lasting effort, we, as students of economics, have an elaborated body of theoretical and applied contributions which can be summed up by a short and catchy name, free market environmentalism, or FME for short. In today's world, in which the protection of environment is one of the most widely debated topics, we all should be very grateful to Professor Anderson because he provided us with an alternative to a standard green arguments. All of us who care about the environment hence do not need to worship the radical left-wing economics ignoring statist ideology, but have an approach based on, guess what? Wieserian opportunity costs. Private property-based and entrepreneurially driven system utilizing our knowledge about incentives or bringing to our attention the lack thereof. In short, free market approach to environmental protection. Professor Anderson is the senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and also the executive director of PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center, a very influential think tank located in Bozeman, Montana, that focuses on market solutions to environmental problems. Terry Anderson is author or editor of 30 books, including Free Market Environmentalism, which is a pioneering attempt to establish a property-based approach to environmental protection. Terry Anderson has published widely in both professional journals and popular press on private property-related issues. I'm delighted and privileged to have Terry Anderson as our keynote speaker today. Professor Anderson, please approach me to receive the PCPE 2011 Wieser Memorial Prize for Excellence in Economic Education.
Thank you very much, Joseph. What an honor and great award. I wasn't expecting that, and I was afraid Peter was just going to take the only one that was there. So thank you. A great pleasure and honor. Also a great pleasure to be in this wonderful city. When my wife Monica and I would tell people we were coming to Prague, if they had been there, they always said, "Oh, you're in for such a treat." And we were walking yesterday and both looked around and said how right they were. It's a spectacular city, and the warm welcome we've gotten is greatly appreciated. When Joseph began the introductions earlier, he talked about who would get the blame. Now I'm a little worried that he won't, and now that Peter's done, he won't. That only leaves one of us. I guess that will be me. It's always good to be introduced by a fellow traveler, a fellow economist, because we economists have so many jokes told about us. Most of them, of course, are probably appropriate. I don't know if here in the Czech Republic you had the series of jokes we had in the United States about if you laid economists in the world end to end, they wouldn't reach a conclusion. But the best one was if you laid the economists in the world end to end, it would be a good thing. And that's probably true for most economic policy. I'm also pleased when I'm not introduced with the question of, you know what an economist is, don't you? And of course you're obliged to say no. And the answer is that an economist is someone who's pretty good with numbers but doesn't have enough personality to be an accountant. I don't think that's a compliment to accountants. So I won't ask you if you're an economist, but I do want to ask you if you're environmentalists. How many of you would consider yourself to be environmentalists? 1, 2. Oh, I have some convincing to do. How many of you would consider yourself to be Hayekians? I assume there are just a few shy people, or we'd see even more hands. I want to try to ask the question and convince you that if Hayek and Coase were environmentalists, what kind of environmentalists would they be? And attempt to convince you that if you are Hayekians, you have a much, or a Coasean or both, you have a very solid foundation on which to raise your hand proudly when asked, are you an environmentalist? Let me talk just a little bit about why, and in so doing, really juxtapose two kinds of environmentalists. One I'll call a political environmentalist, and another I'll call, as Joseph suggested in the introduction, a free market environmentalist. Now, an obvious distinction between the two, and one that most people in this audience might think I'll dwell upon, is that one depends on coercion, the other depends on bargaining and cooperation, respect for property rights. Now, that's a very useful distinction, and one, indeed, I'll talk about later in lectures I'll give next week. But I want to emphasize now that, indeed, that is a distinction. It's an important one, and would be happy to discuss it in more detail. But it's not the one I want to focus on today. And in fact, in preparing this lecture, I've come to really rethink free market environmentalism and the book of that title. In fact, my co-author, Don Leal, and I are writing the 3rd edition of Free Market Environmentalism right now. Well, at least I hope he is, because I'm here playing. At any rate, we're trying to get a 3rd edition written. And as I've thought about this lecture, I've decided that I'm really going to very much change the 2nd chapter, which is, I suppose one might call the theory chapter. And in so doing, I want to sort of run by you some of the new ideas that I think ought to go in that. So I want to distinguish between political environmentalists and free market environmentalists in the following way. And it is to emphasize that I think political environmentalists, and the kind of environmentalists that make most people in this room reluctant to put their hands up when asked if you're an environmentalist, are people who see the environment as a static world, see nature as something that has a picture, a Kodachrome moment, if you will. The idea that this is the way nature would be if human action had never been brought to it. Whereas I think free market environmentalists see the environment as an ever-changing, evolving nature, which includes humankind in it, which includes human action being brought to it. And I think that distinction is far more crucial to really understanding what free market environmentalism is all about than simply saying it's about the difference between coercion on the one hand and bargaining and cooperation on the other. To do that, I want to really, of course, bring in Hayek and bring in Coase and argue that they, I think more than almost anyone else who's written in these areas, provide us a lens, a focus by which we can really understand the environment as a process, markets as a process, and the connection between the two, and suggest that most economists and most economics has really led us down a path that has only one direction it can go, and that is in the form of political environmentalism with the coercion it brings. Here's why I think that economics, as we usually think of it, does that. And I should note that I think it was in our discussions last night, Joseph, but it might have been Peter who told me this, that Walter Block, a good friend and fellow traveler amongst Austrian circles, said that of my institute, PERC, that we're too Chicagoan. And I sort of reeled at that when I heard that criticism. And I think in one sense he's correct. And as I'm thinking about the third edition of Free Market Environmentalism, I can think better as to why that might be what might be a criticism leveled at free market environmentalism and myself. And it is because too much of economics is based on equilibrium theory. And that equilibrium theory then leads us to think about where the world is or ought to be and how we would get there. With that focus, we cannot help but see the environment generally and natural resources as an area where there are pervasive, I'll only use the word once or twice, externalities. I want to suggest that free market environmentalism, as opposed to economics and its equilibrium focus, is the only way to bring human action into a natural world that is one based on or always moving in a disequilibrium kind of way. And even argue, indeed, that not only is free market environmentalism not an oxymoron, it is perhaps the best way to bring together economics, especially Austrian ideas of economics, with the environment. As I mentioned the word oxymoron, I can't help but remember that when the first edition of Free Market Environmentalism was published, one of the reviewers of the book said, "Free market environmentalism is an oxymoron," and then added that Don Leal and Terry Anderson, the authors, are the moron part. I've always wanted to use that as a line in a review of someone's book, maybe just to get even. I said, how many of you are environmentalists, and only got a few hands up? Let me ask this question. How many of you think there are externalities in the world of the environment? Oh, come on, don't be cowards. All right, I'm going to convince you to keep your hands down next time. And let me tell you why. In fact, at my home institute, PERC, I've expunged the word externality from the vocabulary. I want to have T-shirts made up with a big E and a slash through it. You can't use that word at PERC. Let me explain why. If we think about how economists approach the term externalities and define the term externalities, they usually do so with some definitions such as, an externality is a cost imposed upon another person outside the market transition. Or one that I loved when I first encountered it, and now won't even use it, from Paul Haynes' first edition of his book. An externality is a cost imposed upon someone else without his or her consent. I like the consent part, so it resonated well with me. But I think that both of those definitions lead us down a path that can only bring us to political environmentalism, because both of those externalities ignore the important question of who has what rights, who holds the property rights. If someone indeed has been harmed by a transaction between two individuals, the question is, why is the harmed individual, the person on whom supposedly an externality has been perpetrated, not raised his or her hand and say, "Stop, you have violated my rights"? Let me give you a few examples. If I cut down a tree on my land, and that tree is habitat for a bird that you like to watch, have I imposed an E-word, as people who don't like to use externality at my office say, has an E-word been imposed upon you, the bird lover? If you are a smoker and light up a cigarette in the lobby of the hotel in which I'm staying, as happened this morning, have you imposed an externality on me? If I breathe and emit carbon into the atmosphere, have I imposed an externality on you who lives on an island that is low enough that now might rise if temperatures of the globe go up and sea levels come up. And finally, if you don't like the color of my tie, am I imposing an externality on you for offending your tastes? Now, maybe the first one, cutting down the tree, you'd say, well, I don't know. It should be the case that if it's Terry's tree in Terry's yard, Terry's property, he should be able to cut that tree down. But on the other hand, gosh, where will birds live if Terry cuts down trees? Or you might say with smoking the cigarette, well, that's a good question. And in the United States, we've solved that property rights problem by saying you as a smoker used to have the property right, but now you don't any longer. You can't light up the cigarette in the lobby of the hotel, in the restaurant, heaven forbid, in an airport, rather in an airline, and then worse yet, in an airline bathroom. So we've said we don't allow you to own that space for smoking a cigarette. In fact, as Monica and I were changing planes in Vienna, we saw this capsule, this plastic-looking capsule with a door, and we were both, what is that? And then somebody went in and lit up a cigarette. And I thought, well, if you're a smoker, you get to go in a cage, and everybody looks in as if you're at a zoo and some strange creature. But so we've sort of changed the property rights there. My breathing and emitting carbon, ooh, that one gets a little sensitive if you're a climate scientist, in quotes, and are worried about climate change or global warming. But my tie, most people would say, well, of course Terry gets a right to wear his tie. I don't have a right to say no, but let's go back to my definition, or the economist's definition of externality. If two people engage in a transaction, I went to the store, bought the tie, they sold me the tie, I wore it here because Joseph told Pete and I that we both had to dress up for the occasion. So we've engaged in a transaction. If our ties offend you, have you been harmed? Thought of in that way, I think we quickly begin to see that this isn't about costs imposed upon other people. It's about who has what rights. Once we see the world through that lens, once we begin to recognize that it's always a question of who has what rights, then we can ask the important question of, if somebody has a right and they're being harmed by a transaction between two others, why aren't they enforcing their right? Why aren't they saying, stop, you can't impose that cost upon me? The simple answer, I thought the simplest answer, that's what I had in my notes, the simplest answer is two words, transaction costs. But Pete narrowed it to one word, friction. That is to say, there's friction in the system. And you might have a right to be free from my wearing this tie, but we haven't yet negotiated a contract for you to either pay me or me to pay you, and I'll get to that in a few minutes as to which way it might go. But I want to just emphasize for now that if you take the path of equilibrium economics and this intersection point, that it is divergent from where it ought to be, you're only going to be led down a political environmentalism path that leads you to say there are externalities, and the externalities then suggest that they have to be corrected by using coercive action of the government. So, this then brings me to challenge you to think not in terms of equilibrium economics, neoclassical economics, but to get yourself outside of that box and put on what I often call coast-colored glasses, but I'll call here Hayek-colored and coast-colored glasses. I'll start with Hayek and what I think is Hayek's important contribution to the way we can think about the environment in a way that, first off, is just more consistent with how scientists think about or thought about the environment. Start with Darwin. Go back to Darwin and read Darwin, and what you read is not a discussion of an equilibrium in nature, but rather a nature that is always seeking new equilibria, but never achieving them. It is a nature where, if you will, entrepreneurial species are filling niches. a very Kersnerian kind of world, one where these grazers are out there chomping away on grass, and one sees some grass that no one else is eating and says, you know, if I can adapt and eat that grass, I'll get bigger, fatter, stronger, and survive better. And then along comes some other species that sees another niche and fills that. But there's never any equilibrium in that kind of Darwinian world. Let me quote from someone far more eloquent than I, Matt Ridley. Matt Ridley captures this well when he says, quote, "Living beings are eddies in the stream of entropy." That is to say, while the universe gradually becomes more homogeneous and disordered, little parts of it can reverse the trend and become briefly more ordered and complex. One might almost think that was written by Mises. One might think that that was an Austrian economist writing about the economy, not nature. Matt goes on to say that Darwin and Smith had a great deal in common in saying that the economy, quote, is spontaneously self-ordered through the action of individuals rather than ordained by a monarch or a parliament, just as Darwin would have said about nature or the environment. I'll quote later again from the only biologist that I think has this right that I know of, and that's Daniel Botkin, who notes that nature, and I used the term earlier and I stole it from him, is not a Kodachrome still life, but rather is a moving picture show. I suppose today we'd almost say video, but that would be outdated, so we might use DVD, but that would be outdated. So I suppose today that nature is a YouTube moment. At any rate, the important point that Botkin is making as a scientist is that nature is ever-changing as it was seen by Darwin. Therefore, I think it's important to note in thinking about nature that it's much more consistent with an Austrian perspective of market processes than it is with an equilibrium neoclassical view. And I think too few environmentalists recognize it as such. So, where does all of this take us? Well, first off, it doesn't take us to the point of saying that neoclassical economics or equilibria views are inappropriate. Indeed, we can learn a lot by starting with the notion that if there were an equilibrium, what would be the conditions of that? And we can talk about prices being an equilibrating factor in bringing demand and supply together. And we can even ask then important questions that depend on a ceteris paribus set of conditions. That is to say, if we could hold everything else constant, what would happen if we changed one thing? So, if we said in the case of a fishery, a classic case of a natural resource subject to the tragedy of the commons, subject to too many fishers coming in, taking the fish, dissipating the rents, destroying the resource, we might say, well, if we could limit the number of fishermen, wouldn't that then lead us to wouldn't that allow us to halt the tragedy of the commons? At first blush, it seems like a very sensible idea. Or back to my cutting of the tree in which the bird lives. If we could stop Terry from cutting that tree, wouldn't that lead to there being more trees for the birds to live in? Stopped at that Kodachrome still life moment, it sounds as though with that equilibrium perspective, changing just that one little thing, we could achieve some end. But we need to ask, and I always posed it this way to my students, ask the and then what question. So if you do this, then what will happen? And that is the very nature of a world of human action. When one thing changes, it brings about other changes. And the question we can ask a social scientist is, what will be the next occurrence? And how will that next occurrence affect where we are or where we're going? Hayek understood this so fully when he wrote his very famous, and I think one of the most important pieces written in economics, The Use of Knowledge in Society. He understood that there were all of these species out there, if you will, moving around, each with information about his or her niche, moving around, in some cases trying to coordinate with one another, in other cases competing with one another. And the question was, how would they ever bring the information that each one of them had together to have some sort of coordinated civil society, if you will, in a Darwinian kind of sense. And Hayek then emphasized that there was no way we could take the knowledge embedded in each of these species and bring it together in some collective knowledge that would then allow us to manage, in this case, the economy, but think of it in a Darwinian kind of way. Is there any way we could look at the resource base, the ecosystem, to use the word of the day, and put together our knowledge about this ecosystem and then say, aha, we need to do some bioengineering to create a species that will eat this other grass to bring about a greater balance and get more out of the total system. Most ecologists I know would find such an idea nonsensical, as most of the people in this room would find it nonsensical to think about the economy in that way. Hayek's writings really taught us to think about processes that would bring this disparate information held in the minds of everyone in this room and everyone outside this building, even people outside universities, how we would bring that kind of knowledge together and coordinate it in a systematic way. Hayek also, and this was more subtle, I think, in Hayek's writing, also understood that not only can you collectivize all this information, you can't control all of the and then what's that would occur. And so if you tried to, say, stop overfishing by limiting the number of boats, Hayek understood that human action and human minds were so innovative, they would always find new ways around it. And so in the fisheries case, we say limit the number of boats. Everybody said, got that tragedy of the commons fixed. And the fishermen say, bigger boats. So we said, we'll limit the size of the boats. And the people in the fishery say, we'll put more capital into our boats. We'll have bigger nets, more electronic equipment. We say, well, we'll limit the number of days you can fish. And they fish 24 hours every day that they can fish. There is no limit to the number of ways that human beings respond when they see these rents, any more than there's any limit to the way species respond when they see rents, if you will, or niches in the environment. And so I think Hayek's way of thinking is much more consistent with Darwin, with Smith, and certainly with the way I think of nature. Let me come back to Daniel Botkin, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier. He, again, in my mind, is one of the few scientists who really captures quite well, I think, the important way of thinking about the environment that then brings a sort of nexus with Hayek and Coase. Botkin says, nature, quote, is by its very essence discordant, created from the simultaneous movements of many tones, the combination of many processes flowing at the same time along various scales, leading not to a simple melody, but to a symphony that sometimes is harsh and sometimes pleasing. And that's how I think we look at the environment. We look out and we see this beautiful hillside of green trees and hear the birds chirping. We say, oh, isn't that a wonderful symphony? The next day there's a raging forest fire and we call it a wildfire, and what are we going to do to stop it? Those are both parts of what Botkin is saying nature is about. And I might add, they're both parts of what economies are about. He went on to say, quote, having altered nature with our technology, I might just substitute for technology the words having altered nature with human action. We must depend on technology, parentheses, human action, to see us through the solutions. The task before us is to understand the biological world to be the point that we have learned, understand the biological world to the point that we can learn to live within the discordant harmonies of our biological surrounds, so that they are a function not only to promote a continuation of life, but also to the benefit of ourselves, our aesthetics, our morality, philosophies, and material needs. Recent article by philosopher Mark Sagoff, soon to join George Mason University, said that ecological knowledge, like any kind of empirical knowledge insofar as it is relevant to economic activity, is too spread out among people to be captured by any one individual or by any group of individuals, even given careful planning and sufficient resources. I might say, sound a little like Hayek. A science of ecosystem services that captures economic production or value in a final biophysical unit lies beyond the human potential. The ecosystem services project, as he described it, which might be the calculation debate, is bound to fail in its attempt to substitute in natura calculations of the value for the artifice of market price. Back to what I think Hayek brings to us as environmentalists. If we approach the environment as a calculation debate, and I might note here that the time I spend at Stanford, there's a large group of people there who talk about natural capital, and most business people say, oh, that's wonderful. We have environmentalists talking about nature in business kinds of terms. And what they're doing is trying to calculate the value of nature. Again, this is the calculation debate all over again, except it's in the context of the environment. And guess what? The calculations suggest that nature is invaluable. Okay? Now, tell me how to use that information. Hayek really said, look, that you can't just calculate values. Values are something that each of us has. We exercise them through a coordination process in a civil society, usually called markets, but other ways, as Peter pointed out earlier. And in the market process, we get prices. And those prices then allow us to coordinate all of this little bits and pieces of knowledge. And that knowledge includes, what's this little stream worth? What's that tree that the bird lives in worth? What are each of these components of this thing we call the environment worth as reflected through market prices? And so I don't think you can be an environmentalist without putting on Hayekian glasses. You can't really see the environment in the way that Darwin saw the environment unless you think, as Darwin did or as Hayek did, about the disparate knowledge that's out there in each one of those individual species and how their interaction, in a social setting at least, brings out a set of measurable prices that then allow us to interact. So Hayek gives us prices. What does Coase give us? Well, of course, Coase gives us at least property rights. Let me here tell a quick story about a friend in New Zealand, Roger Beattie, who has property rights to fish for abalone, the shellfish that they call paua, but a shellfish that is quite valuable. The meat is very valuable. The shells are very valuable. Roger Beattie tells us this wonderful story, told me this story, of how he was raising abalone in a bay on the north part of the South Island of New Zealand. And as he raised these abalone, they were growing quite well. He had built some barrels in which they could, to which they could affix themselves and in which they could live and grow. And he was really excited. And all of a sudden, they weren't doing so well. And he looked around, and the reason they weren't doing so well was there was effluent from a neighboring agricultural area coming into the bay. Note I haven't used another word I hate, pollution. I said there was effluent, some waste from the cows, if you will, coming into the bay. Now, if I go back and think through my neoclassical equilibrium glasses, I would say, aha, we have a social cost not being taken care of here. We have an externality being imposed on Roger Beattie, who would have said, I have a right to grow my abalone. And if he had walked up and knocked on the farmer's door and said, clean up the mess from your cows, what do you think the farmer would have said? Why should I? I have a right for my cows to do what cows always do, always have done, always will do. And I've been dumping my effluent into the bay long before you arrived. I was here first. Now, Roger is an Austrian economist through and through, a clear anarchist, a classical liberal. He never once thought about knocking on the farmer's door, except to say when he knocked on the door, was, I would like to purchase from you the right you have for your cow's effluent to go into the bay. He said, you have the right. I'm not even going to debate with you. I want to cease the effluent. I've read Coase, and he has. Let me purchase from you the right to not dump effluent. Poof, the solution was solved. Roger paid the farmer found cheaper ways to raise his cattle without the effluent reducing Roger's output. Roger didn't he asked the question of who has what rights, but he didn't debate the question in court. He just accepted that the farmer had the rights and moved on. Coase really taught us to focus in this way on every single environmental issue we think about. Coase said, who has what rights? Note if you step back in the Roger Beatty story and say, I don't know, I haven't heard enough, I don't know who has which rights. Coase's argument was, if transaction costs are low enough, it won't matter. And Coase was what I like to call a causal agnostic. That is, he didn't ask the question of who caused the problem. That is, did Roger bring his abalone into the bay and cause the problem that wouldn't have been a problem if they weren't there? Or did Roger have his abalone in the bay and the problem was caused by the cow's effluent? Coase would have said, I don't know who is causing the problem because I don't know who has which rights. Beatty said, I will accept the farmer's right and resolve it accordingly. Indeed, if you look through Coase's article, you will not find the E word. He never uses the E word in the problem of social cost. And I've talked to him about this. I don't think he undoubtedly used it in something he wrote since he's a prolific writer. But he avoided the word because it is not useful, especially if you think through Coasean or see the world through Coasean glasses, namely glasses that focus you on who has what rights. Alan Randall, another economist who's written about this and whom I like because he agrees with me, put it the following way in describing externalities. He said, externality is a vacuous and unhelpful term, and suggested that we replace it with more precise terminology based on the notions of non-exclusiveness and non-rivalry. I would just say, replace it with the term property rights. Once we do that, we have a much clearer focus on what these environmental problems are and how we might approach them. So, back to the question, if Hayek and Coase were environmentalists. If they were, Hayek would emphasize the disequilibrium similarities between markets and nature. And he would emphasize the important role that prices would play in condensing information about the values of nature. If Coase were an environmentalist, and for all I know, if Professor Hayek were still here, he might have raised his hand saying he was an environmentalist. I haven't asked Professor Coase, who is still alive, but I think Coase would emphasize the role of property rights and transaction costs, what role they would play in resolving conflicting demands for scarce resources. Does my demand for the wood from the tree trump your demand for birds? And how do we resolve those conflicting demands? So, the good news is, in this word, let me conclude. Let me conclude by changing the question around slightly. What if environmentalists, the few of us who would raise our hands bravely, were actually Hayekians and Coaseans, and some of us are, i.e., what if environmentalists understood the role of markets and prices and respected property rights? What would the world look like? Begin by understanding that we as environmentalists, we who are all environmentalists now, and I think most of us are to a certain extent, can be environmentalists because we're wealthy. How did we get wealthy? Well, let me think. We got wealthy through property rights, leading to markets and prices and economic growth, all of which underpinned by a rule of law and siding with Peter, a rule of law that comes from the bottom up through our anarchistic kinds of institutions. But nonetheless, we got rich through markets, and that's what allows us to really worry about that tree and the bird or carbon emissions. So, we would stop thinking, I think, about nature as separate from human beings. Something that would be in equilibrium would be a Kodachrome still life moment, were it not for human action. And rather, we as environmentalists would see nature and human action as one, coming together through processes, including markets. From Hayek, we would understand that the use of knowledge in society requires a way of condensing information about the costs and benefits through prices, and stop thinking about whether we can determine the value in the same way that debate was taken on decades ago with respect to the environment. I think we would look for ways of contracting, as my friend Roger Beatty did. We would, I think, instead of battling over property rights in every case, find ways of using the property rights at hand and bargaining over them. Indeed, I might note that at PERC, and we have a graduate of this program in the audience, at PERC we have a program we call PERC's Enviropreneur Institute, Environmental Entrepreneurs, Enviropreneurs, in which I think that the simplest way to understand what we do in that institute and what the people who come to it are about is they are entrepreneurs, people looking at niches, who are taking the property rights as they are and asking how can we contract over them. If we were Hayekian and Coasean environmentalists, we would recognize that markets, prices, and property rights will not lead to some environmental nirvana that ignores opportunity costs, but will lead to niche filling and environmental entrepreneurship. And with this I'll close. Most importantly, perhaps, if we as environmentalists would simply dare to don the Hayekian and Coasean glasses that I've been trying to ask you to see the world through, we would be free market environmentalists, not political environmentalists, searching for more effective ways of achieving environmental ends, not seeking environmental demands, and in so doing would indeed, most importantly, maintain the fabric of a free society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry, for your wonderful talk and also for sticking to our schedule, which means we have something like 10-15 minutes for debate and discussion. So again, the floor is open for discussion. The mic is here somewhere.
We should have recruited a few people off the streets who really are environmentalists. That would raise questions.
All right, we have here a question of first row. Here.
I'm convinced that we should not use the E word in most cases. Would you be against
in any case, don't give up.
Even internalization of, to say it's not a problem, would you be willing to say it in that case? Or we shouldn't even use the term internalization of.
I love it. When I get people in that corner, I know I've won them over. When they want to spit it out, but they can't, and it's not just you. I guarantee you will stop. You will stop even when I'm not in the room. Why would I not use the word internalization? I wouldn't, because there's no reason to. The question is, what are the property rights? What are the contractual terms? And how and why are they or aren't they being adhered to? So if we take something like the sort of rent seeking that Peter talked about, we want to ask, well, what is it that allows Peter to use the state to come after rents that are somehow associated with my actions? The answer is that the state is not honoring my property rights and is taking those property rights and the value of them away from me and transferring them to Peter. I didn't have to use the word. If we talk about it in the context of shirking or of other kinds of opportunistic behavior in a business kind of sense. We don't have to say that the person who is not honoring the contract is imposing on the other people, but rather that the property rights are not sufficiently well defined and enforced to internalize, that one I don't mind using, internalize the costs and benefits so they're accounted for. If we always use the property rights framework, add to it contracting, if you will, and then think about keeping it really simple, friction in the system, we can understand all this, and we don't fall into the trap of using the word, which immediately, I should add this, because I think this is really something I should have said earlier and forgot to mention, and I think it's really important, and I will use it for this purpose. If you believe my tie is imposing an externality on you, you are immediately suggesting that you have a right to be free from the colors reflecting off my tie toward you. We use the word then as a sort of normative way of establishing rights. Oh, that cigarette you lit up violates my rights. You've imposed an externality on me. And boom, we've trumped the trump card on the table and said, aha, I have a right and you violated it. But that's not clear. In my tie, I don't think it's at all clear that you have a right to be free from the colors of my tie. In the case of Roger Beatty, we could carry on a long debate about did he have a right to have the bay free of cow effluent, or did the owner of the cows have a right to dump the effluent. If Roger had asserted, the effluent is an externality, he would be just simply saying, I have a right to be free from cow effluent. Stated in that way, it's probably far less useful for a rhetorical device to win over the court or the political system, but I think it leads us down the wrong kind of path as classical liberals, as environmentalists, because it doesn't get to the root issue of why there's a problem at all. Let me go ahead, let's take questions.
One question. Here one, and then at the back another one. Yeah, go ahead.
Professor Anderson, both your lecture and the lecture of Professor Betke has a common question which is behind them, the question of robustness of free market solutions or property rights-based solutions, because I understand that why property rights-based solutions are not allowed to evolve. But sometimes they have evolved, but then have been replaced. Why is it so often that they have been replaced by state solution? Once they evolved, what's your opinion?
Okay. I'll let my mind catch up. I thought you were going a different direction, so I'll catch up with the direction you went, which I think is very fruitful. Let me restate it to make sure I have the question clear. If free market, and put it in the context of my expertise, if I have any, if free market environmentalism is so good and such a useful way of resolving these conflicting demands for resources, why do people turn toward political environmentalism? Is that a fair way of rephrasing your question? Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think we're on the same track anyway. I think part of the reason for the change is embedded in the word externality, and it's embedded in it in the sense that each of us has a view of what is the, I'll call it optimal or better yet, call it the most ethical set of rights. Okay? And we through this externality perspective, begin to think that the rights that exist aren't ethical. They aren't right. They shouldn't be there. Let me give you one example I've dealt with, and I think it'll perhaps illustrate this. In the United States, many people who have cattle have rights to graze their cattle on the public lands, on the lands that the United States government controls. And the environmental community in general would like to get the cattle off of those lands. They don't like the smell. They don't like the cattle grazing by the streams. They're just not part of nature. And so I talked to some environmentalists about, well, look, there's a very easy solution here. Why don't the people who don't want the cattle raise some money and purchase the rights, just as Roger Beatty did in my example here? Isn't that a proper solution? And let me give you two answers from heads of two of the biggest environmental groups in the United States, the Audubon Society and the Environmental Defense Fund. The Environmental Defense Fund, a very practical environmental group, and in some sense a free market environmental group, they just wanted to get the cattle off the lands. And their president said, I understand you fully. Some of my friends would say the cattle people should not have the rights, but they do. Let's use markets. The Audubon Society person said, you're right, we could use markets, but they shouldn't have the rights. I'd say, but they do. He'd say, well, we could buy them, but they shouldn't have them. And I never could convince him that if you really just want cattle off the land, engage in the trade. And the point then becomes, his goal, I don't think, was getting the cattle off the lands. He might have gotten the cattle off if he did this, but his goal was, those were not the proper set of rights. They shouldn't have the rights. Let's take them away. And if you continually think through an externality lens, you see the world as full of externalities. Every tie that people wears that you don't like is an externality. And as soon as you see that, you begin to say, they shouldn't have a right to choose their ties. Well, I don't need to tell you where that slippery slope goes. So I think that the reason even when we see free market environmentalism working, it gets pushed to the side by people who use the externality shouldn't have the rights kinds of arguments. And if they have the power to do that, so much for this tie.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
Professor Anderson, my name is Philip. I'm from Vienna, of all places. As Professor Schiemann said, not so much Austrian economics going on there these days. Thanks for your lecture. My own kind of free market inventimalism has come under pressure lately, speaking of disaster in Japan. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, the difference in scale, because one thing is the tie, the bird, and the cow dump, but when the scale gets so big that it's not only a thing about externalities, but it's such a high risk, and how would you think that this would work, that people contract this kind of risks? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I suppose if Armin Alchian was here or Kos were here, they'd give you the two-word, or we can use the single-word friction, but we'll use transaction cost answer. That when you say scale, what you're referring to is the transaction costs associated with enforcing property rights, as if we take the Japanese case, as we go in these sort of concentric rings outside the exact location of the nuclear reactor, all right? So thought of in that way, you might say, well, okay, let's back away from the fact that it's a state-owned nuclear reactor. Okay, that all bets are off when you start with that problem. And maybe I'd use the word states get to impose externalities all over the place, but I'll try to avoid that one. So if you start with it being a privately owned reactor, so I own this thing and I am responsible. And Now I look at the first ring. Can I contract with the people in the first ring? I've got contracts with people to deliver the electricity that's coming from it, and they're paying me to do so. Well, I look at the first ring and I say, can I contract with those people? And the first ring, let's just take it as 100 meters. Most people would say, of course, you can identify all the people within 100 meters. Well, what about 200 meters? What about a kilometer? What about 10 kilometers? Well, obviously, the more rings that we move out, the more people with whom you must contract, but also the lesser the risk. As Monica and I are on the west coast of the United States right now, I wouldn't say that they've imposed an externality on me. I don't think I had a right to be free from it. I don't think they had to, and they wouldn't worry about contracting with me. So the question then is better phrased in terms of, do the people have a right to be free from the potential radiation? Let me even back up one step. Suppose the reactor's there and you move next to it. What would be the price of the land? Suppose no one had ever been on it, but I owned the land. Well, the price of the land would be less because you're accepting more risk. Would I say there is I wouldn't. I'd say you got a property right to a set of, to land that included in it the risk of some radiation. But if you were already there and I wanted to locate, I'd have to negotiate with you. And look, I didn't say there aren't transaction costs. Coase never said there weren't transaction costs. Transaction costs are the friction in the world. And the things that mitigate against transaction costs are precisely the kind of anarchistic institutions that I think Peter was talking about earlier. There certainly at some point is the potential that these anarchistic institutions will have to confront their borders with other anarchistic institutions. And in fact, thought of in that way, at least from my mind, I'm seeing more of a nexus between what Peter had to say and what I have to say than originally. And that nexus would be that think of the reactor as an anarchistic institution. They brought in some stuff, they put it all together, and just a group of people in this free society that's called the reactor owner and company, bargaining with other people to deliver the electricity, are sitting there as one institution, and next to it is a group of farmers. And let's suppose that's an anarchistic institution where they have a set of rules about their farming. These two things are on the border with one another. They will interact at some point. It may be the cows walking over to the reactor and unplugging the cord and having the thing heat up. I mean, it could have gone that way, right? And the question becomes, what kind of umbrella institutions or larger institutions might mitigate against or help those margins? I think, again, I don't see any reason to use the word externality in that whole discussion. It's all about property rights and transaction costs.
Hello, my name is Slava Černý. I'd like to ask you a question regarding environment and entrepreneurship and responsibility, as you talked, because it has been reported a few years ago that in the middle of Pacific Ocean there is a huge pile of garbage, like shit, in the size of the state of Texas, and it's killing thousands of...
Some people might say, what's the difference? But go ahead. It would be people who aren't from Texas, I hope I...
I mean, it's just garbage in the size of Texas, and it's killing thousands of animals. And, I mean, what's your point of view? Who's responsible for that in this so-called free society, free market, and, entrepreneurship?
Okay, excellent. The first question is, it's always the first question. What are the property rights? Who owns this? Let me start with the garbage, okay? If this garbage is owned, it was owned by somebody to start with, right? It was, I don't have anything to throw away up here, but if it was the bottle that the person behind you is holding, and we could identify the fingerprints on the bottle, we could say, aha, we know whose garbage it is, right? Now, high transaction cost if it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but it's a property rights kind of issue. So all this garbage got put together and somehow dumped there. Who dumped it? That's a property rights kind of question. let me come back to even how those transaction costs might be dealt with. But so the question is, who owns the garbage in the first place? Right? But now let's switch to the other side. Is there a cost created? Well, if nobody owns it, why don't they? Answer, it isn't worth owning. Nobody has taken the time to go out there and put a fence around that piece of ocean. Now, you can engage in a calculation debate if you like, and tell me that the fish in that ocean are worth 10 trillion Czech crowns. 10 trillion, if you like, but it doesn't tell me anything about whether there's any damage done. Oh, you can tell me you really feel badly at night and don't sleep because there are dead fish. I feel for you. I'm sorry you lost sleep. But if it's worth it to you, go out and try to enforce some property rights to those fish. Why haven't you? Answer, because the costs are so trivial relative to the benefits to somebody dumping the garbage. If it were otherwise, somebody would have established property rights to those fish. So I don't even think there's a cost. That is to say, nothing is damaged that's of value to human beings. If you want to come back and say, well, but nature has intrinsic value, let me tell you, you've just stepped out onto the slippery slope of externalities, because you're going to use the argument, I can't sleep at night because fish are dying, that's imposing an externality on me. If you go that route, there's only one solution, political environmentalism. You tell the garbage dumper, you have imposed a cost on me because I can't sleep at night because of dying fish. And it's absolutely no different than the tie at that point. So, but let's suppose that somebody owns the fish. Now what's going to happen? Well, we're to Roger Beatty again. He owned the abalone. They were his. The garbage, if you will, being dumped belonged to somebody else. He knew who it was. Coast just sits there saying, told you so, told you so. Coast recognized that this is what Coast wrote about. Okay? Now, let me back away from who owns the garbage. It's not going to be easy to identify who owns that garbage. But suppose we change it slightly, and this is happening at this moment. Let's change the example to underground water wells, of which there are many, and people dumping their gunk, their effluent, into the ground, and it seeps out. Have they created an externality? Well, it depends. Do you have a property right to clean water from your well? Let's answer yes. Okay? Now we don't need the word again. You have a property right. Someone has violated it. Why don't you enforce it? Well, if there's one company dumping gunk, and it's a private company dumping gunk, and you know it's their gunk because they dump blue gunk and your water is blue, case resolved. You're going to go to them and say, my water has been affected, my property right's been violated. Now, it's not always that simple. I sat on a PhD dissertation of a young woman who now is a professor at the University of Michigan, spent some time at PERC, which I'd encourage all of you to think about doing, www.perc.org. That's an unpaid-for commercial, as were Pete's about his book. A young woman spent time at PERC, and what she was doing was identifying ways, and she was an engineer, ways in which you could backtrack from the well to where the effluent started. What is that all about? It's about defining and enforcing property rights. If you think of your garbage in the ocean in that way, you begin to ask, who owns the ocean water, or the fish, or the things that are there? Whose gunk is it? Who has the right to put gunk in the ocean, or who has the right to be free? And I haven't solved the problem, but at least you begin to focus on the kinds of institutions. And once it gets valuable, I've written about the American West, you might think of the American West as being like the ocean at one point. People said, I don't want to be out there. It's dangerous. It's not a very pleasant place. It's hot in the summer, cold in the winter. But then it got valuable, and people said, I'm putting my fence up. They established property rights. And then if you dumped your garbage, you had a cause of action. So it's always about property rights.
Thanks a lot. I'm afraid we don't have time for more debates, formal debates. However, informal debates can continue. Those of you who are joining us for dinner, the dinner at the whole gala reception will be in this place starting at 7 o'clock. So come, and I'm sure that we can talk about difficult issues for hours. There will be plenty of food and drinks to entertain us a little bit, and even maybe music. So those who paid for dinner show up at about 7 o'clock here. The rest of you, for the rest of you, I'm very happy you came just for this public part of the whole event. Thank you for coming. Students of the University of Economics, Prague, will have a chance to meet and talk to Professor Anderson starting Monday. Please, the Monday talk will be actually another annual lecture giving at the Center Bank. The entrance to the bank is from the Senovážné náměstí, so please be on time. The rest of you, if you like CEVRO Institute, if you are around, you'll be always welcome. Show up, come to our events. We try not only to provide quality education for our students, but also to have social events, conferences, concerts, parties, and a lot of other interesting things. So again, thank you for coming, and have a nice evening.
One last word. The good news is that neither Peter nor I are providing the music. That would be an externality.